It started as a simple road trip, 4 states, a week off, and the kind of solitude you don't know you need until you've gone too long without it. I hadn't expected much beyond some playlists and truck stop coffee. What I got instead, though, was something I'll never forget. Something I still think about every time my car passes through an unfamiliar stretch of highway. It was about halfway through the second day when I saw it. A detour sign. Bright orange reflective letters screamed, "Detour, next exit." It wasn't on my GPS, and I was wary. The next service station was over 40 miles away, and my gas light had just blinked on. I decided to take the exit. The ramp spiraled me off the highway, dumping me onto an unlit stretch of road that the GPS didn't seem to recognize. The asphalt looked like it hadn't been repaved in decades. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The lines faded to near nothingness. On either side, dense forests leaned into the road, their branches like skeletal fingers, brushing the roof of my car. Still, I kept driving. What choice did I have? The further I went, the stranger it got. My phone dropped signal almost immediately. The gas station promised by a weathered old sign never materialized. Instead, I came to a fork in the road, marked by an old-fashioned wooden post. Carved letters on one arm read, "Sundown Hollow, 12 miles." The other, "Turn back." But there was no way to turn back. Not really. The gas gauge needle quivered just above empty, and the thought of being stranded in the dark woods alone wasn't one I was willing to entertain. I took the road to Sundown Hollow. That's when the first oddity happened. At first, it was subtle. My headlights seemed dimmer, like something was leaching the light out of them. The trees crowded closer, casting elongated shadows that danced on the edges of my vision. Then I saw the car. An old boxy sedan from the 80s sat just off the road, tilted at an angle, like it had been abandoned mid-swerve. Its door hung open, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I slowed down, rolling past it cautiously. Something about it didn't sit right. The windows were opaque with grime, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that someone, or something, was sitting in the driver's seat. The figure turned its head just slightly. I floored it. The town appeared suddenly, like it had been dropped into the clearing by mistake. A single gas station flickered at the edge of the main street, its fluorescent lights buzzing angrily. I pulled up to the only pump and jumped out, ready to breathe a sigh of relief, until I noticed something. The pump nozzle didn't have a hose, just a jagged edge where it had been ripped away. I backed up toward my car, turning to yell for help when I saw them. 3 figures stood across the street in front of what looked like a boarded-up general store. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, heads tilted ever so slightly to the side like they were trying to hear something over a bad connection. Their faces, they didn't have faces. Panic took over. I jumped back in my car and turned the key, desperate to get out of there. But as the engine roared to life, a 4th figure appeared. It stood in the middle of the road I'd come from, blocking my way back. This one had a face. Its features were sharp and human enough to pass for normal at a glance. But its smile stretched too far, and its eyes didn't blink. The thing raised a hand, gesturing slowly for me to come closer. Instead, I yanked the gear shift into reverse and peeled out of the lot, aiming blindly for the other road branching deeper into the town. The next few hours were a blur of wrong turns and creeping dread. Every street I took looked like the last. Narrow, uneven asphalt, flanked by dilapidated buildings and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I was trapped, the edges of my sanity fraying with each loop through the nightmare town. Eventually, the road opened up again, leading me back to the fork where it all began. Relief washed over me As I hit the highway ramp, the comforting glow of gas station signs and taillights ahead. But when I glanced at my rearview mirror, I froze. The car from before was there again. Its headlights were off, but I could see it, close enough now to make out the outline of the figure inside. Its head was tilted, just like the ones in Sundown Hollow. Only this time, its eyes were open, and it was smiling. The sight of the car in my rear view felt like ice plunging into my chest. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine groaning as my car pushed itself to its limit. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a lifeline that I couldn't afford to lose. But the car stayed with me. At first, it maintained a steady distance, like a predator sizing up its prey. But then, the headlights snapped on, blinding in their intensity. The vehicle lurched forward, closing the gap with an unnatural speed. I swerved into the left lane, hoping to shake it, but the car mirrored my movements perfectly. It loomed closer until its grille filled my mirror, its headlights spilling into my cabin like an interrogation spotlight. And then it hit me. The force of the collision sent my car fishtailing, tires screaming as I struggled to regain control. I could hear metal grinding as the sedan rammed me again, forcing me toward the edge of the road. Panic clouded my thoughts, but instinct kicked in. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, slamming my brakes at the same time. My car spun in a wild arc, the tires barely gripping the asphalt. The sedan rocketed past me, veering off the road and into the trees with a deafening crash. For a moment, everything was silent. My breath came in ragged gasps, the smell of burnt rubber filling my nose. But then I heard it. A soft creak echoed from the woods. I turned, gripping the wheel like a lifeline as my eyes searched the shadows. The car door. It swung open slowly, groaning on its hinges like it hadn't been used in decades. A figure emerged, stepping into the glow of my headlights. It was the driver, but its form seemed wrong now. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways they shouldn't. And its face, that smile. It stretched wider than before, the skin splitting as though it couldn't contain the expression. The thing raised a hand and pointed at me. That was all I needed. I slammed the car into gear and took off, not daring to look back. The highway signs passed in a blur, but I didn't stop. Not until the sun rose, casting its warm light over the world and banishing the nightmare shadows to whatever corner of reality they came from. I pulled into a gas station just outside the next town, stumbling out of the car on shaky legs. The attendant gave me a strange look, probably because I was pale as a sheet and trembling like a leaf. "Long night?" he asked, his voice casual. I nodded, swallowing hard. "You could say that." He handed me a coffee, and I drained it in one go, hoping it would steady me. As I turned to leave, I asked a question that had been clawing at the back of my mind. "You ever heard of a place called Sundown Hollow?" The attendant froze, his eyes narrowing. "You been there?" I shook my head quickly. "No, just saw a sign for it. Looked like an old road." He stared at me for a moment before lowering his voice. "If you're smart, you'll never go looking for it. People who go that way don't usually come back the same, if they come back at all." I didn't respond. I just got back in my car and drove away, the shadows of the woods feeling far closer than they should have been. It's been months now, and life has gone back to normal. Mostly. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the rear view. A flash of old headlights, or a shadow that doesn't belong. And I wonder, did I really escape Sundown Hollow? Or is it just waiting for the right moment to come back for me? It was past midnight when the tire blew out. Just one loud pop, And then the car started pulling hard to the right. I wrestled it to a stop on the shoulder, heart racing. This wasn't part of the plan. The road stretched out endlessly under a canopy of stars, deserted except for the occasional howl of a distant coyote. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, just a two-lane blacktop slicing through a vast ocean of desert. No houses, no towns, no streetlights. Just me, my broken-down car, and miles of unforgiving wilderness. I popped the trunk and grabbed the jack and spare. The flashlight from my glove compartment flickered weakly, barely holding on to life. But it would have to do. I kneeled by the flat tire, gravel digging into my knees, and started working on the lug nuts. That's when I heard it. A sound. Subtle at first, like the whisper of the wind, but unmistakably human. It was a laugh, low and guttural, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, flashlight beams sweeping through the darkness. Nothing but the skeletal outlines of scrub bushes and the faint shimmer of the road stretching into the abyss. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding far too small. No answer. Just the endless, suffocating silence of the desert. I went back to work, hands shaking, and tried to convince myself I had imagined it. But the feeling that I wasn't alone had started to creep in, settling in my chest like a heavy weight. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, the darkness playing tricks on me, shapes morphing into figures just out of the corner of my eye. Finally, the spare was on, and I lowered the car back onto the ground. Relief flooded through me. I tossed the tools back into the trunk, slammed it shut, and climbed back into the driver's seat. The car roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was out there. I drove for maybe 10 minutes, the road winding through the desolate landscape, when I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a shimmer of heat playing tricks on the asphalt. But as I got closer, the shape took on definition. It was a man. He stood in the middle of the road facing me, illuminated in the pale wash of my headlights. He was tall and rail-thin, wearing a suit that looked decades out of fashion. His face was obscured, but something about the way he stood, unnaturally still, set every nerve in my body on edge. I slowed to a stop, unsure of what to do. My headlights bathed him in stark light, yet he didn't move, didn't acknowledge the car at all. I honked the horn. No reaction. I rolled down the window just enough to yell, "Hey, you okay?" The man turned his head slowly, unnaturally, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. His face was pale, almost glowing, and his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like two endless voids that seemed to pull the light out of the air. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to gun it and get as far away from this man as possible. But when I pressed the gas, the car didn't move. The engine roared, the tires spun, but it was like the car was rooted in place. The man started walking toward me. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he didn't quite know how to operate his own body. He reached out one hand, thin fingers outstretched, and I realized with a jolt of terror that he wasn't walking. He was floating. His feet didn't touch the ground. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away as fast as I could. The man stopped, head tilting to the side as if amused by my panic. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. 1 second he was there, and the next, the road was empty. I didn't wait to question it. I floored it, speeding down the highway, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of a gas station on the horizon, a beacon of safety in the middle of nowhere. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy when I stumbled inside, babbling about the man on the road. He said I was the third person this month to come through with the same story. "You were lucky," he said, voice low. "Most don't make it out." "Make it out of what?" I asked, still shaking. He leaned in close, eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "That road doesn't lead anywhere you want to go." I never took a road trip alone again. After the gas station, I should have felt safe. I should have felt relief knowing I wasn't crazy, that others had seen him too. But what the attendant said lingered in my mind, like the stale smell of gasoline in the air. Asterisk. That road doesn't lead anywhere you want to go. I stayed parked under the buzzing neon light of the gas station for what felt like hours, watching the highway in both directions. The thought of continuing down that desolate stretch made my skin crawl. But what choice did I have? It was either move forward or risk staying stranded in the middle of nowhere. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I made the mistake of asking the attendant for advice. "Stick to the main road," he said, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Don't stop for anything or anyone, and whatever you do, if you see him again, don't acknowledge him." That last part made my blood run cold. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. Back in the car, the road stretched out ahead of me, like a black ribbon unraveling into the void. I drove faster than I should have, my eyes darting between the cracked asphalt and the rearview mirror. The miles crawled by, every shadow cast by my headlights morphing into sinister shapes. It wasn't long before the sense of unease returned. The car began to vibrate, not like before, when the tire blew, but a deep, resonant hum that I could feel in my bones. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The darkness swallowed everything. I flicked the light switch desperately, praying for them to come back on. They didn't. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the air around me was vibrating. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw him again. The man in the suit. Only this time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking, or gliding, straight toward the car. His movements were jerky and surreal, like an old film reel, missing half its frames. I froze. My hands locked onto the steering wheel, my breath caught in my chest. The gas station attendant's words echoed in my head. "Don't acknowledge him." But it was too late. I already had. The hum reached a deafening pitch as the man's face came into focus in the mirror. Those eyes, those endless consuming voids, locked onto mine. I felt a pull, an irresistible force dragging me into that blackness. It wasn't just my sight. It was my thoughts, my memories, my very essence being sucked out of me. I screamed and slammed the gear shift into drive, flooring the gas pedal. The car roared to life, but it felt sluggish, like I was dragging something heavy behind me. Into the rearview mirror, the man was gone. But he wasn't gone. The hum was inside the car now, filling every corner, every crevice. My head pounded, my vision blurred, and I swerved wildly down the road. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as though something else was guiding it, something not human. Then I saw it. A light in the distance. Not like the gas station. This was brighter, harsher, cutting through the darkness like a knife. It grew larger as I sped toward it until it consumed everything. And then, silence. When I woke up, I was slumped over the steering wheel, the car idling on the shoulder of the highway. The sun was rising, painting the desert in soft hues of pink and orange. There was no sign of the man, no sign of the light, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I should have been relieved. I should have chalked it up to exhaustion, a bad dream. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My eyes. They weren't mine. They were his. I never went back to that stretch of road, but sometimes, late at night, I feel the hum, and when I look in the mirror, I swear those void-like eyes are staring back at me, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into the darkness. You know that eerie stillness, the kind that makes your skin crawl? That's how this all started, alone in the middle of nowhere, in a car, during a road trip meant to be liberating, but quickly spiraling into something out of a nightmare. The plan was straightforward. Drive across 3 states, camp under the stars, and disconnect from the suffocating monotony of everyday life. It was late summer, and the promise of adventure stretched out in front of me like an empty road. The kind of promise that whispers *freedom*. I should have known better. Somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, I pulled over to a rest stop around 11 p.m. It wasn't on the map. One of those places you only stumble upon when you're lost. No big signs, no gas station. Just a cracked asphalt lot, a few empty picnic tables, and an old weather-beaten sign reading, "Rest area. Use at your own risk." I should have left then. I killed the engine and stepped out into the brisk mountain air. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful at first, calming even. But as I walked to stretch my legs, that peace soured. It wasn't one thing, but the culmination of little details that didn't sit right. The trash cans, for one, were pristine. No graffiti, no overstuffed bags spilling over. Who maintains a place this remote? Then the picnic tables. They were new, freshly painted, unblemished by time or vandals. And there was the restroom, a small stone building, lights flickering faintly in the windows. But when I approached it, the temperature dropped, and the smell of damp earth and mildew made me recoil. The strangest part? A car sat parked on the far side of the lot, its interior cloaked in shadows. I hadn't noticed it pulling in, but its presence was unmistakable now. Dust covered its hood like it hadn't moved in weeks. Yet, the faint glow of a dome light flickered on and off, as though someone inside was moving, watching. I decided to stay in my car. Sleep didn't come easy, not because of the lumpy back seat or the stiffness in my neck, but because of *. The noises. At first I thought it was the wind, faint whispers brushing against the car, soft enough to be mistaken for my imagination. But the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. Words, impossible to discern, but undeniably human. My chest tightened as I sat up, peering out through the condensation streaking the windows. The parking lot was empty, or so it seemed. A shadow darted between the rest stop building and the tree line. I swear it moved too fast to be an animal, too deliberate. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone to call for help, but naturally, I had no service. That's when I noticed something else. My car clock had frozen. 2:13 a.m., the same minute for over an hour now. The dome light in the other car flickered again. This time, it stayed on, and as it did, I saw a figure, a woman, sitting in the driver's seat. Her head was bowed, long hair obscuring her face, but something about her was wrong. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving, her posture rigid as though she'd been carved from stone. I blinked, and she was gone. I bolted out of the car, heart pounding, and made the worst mistake of my life. I ran to the restroom. In hindsight, I can't explain why. Maybe I thought it was safer than staying outside. Maybe I needed the illusion of walls between me and whatever was out there. But the moment I stepped inside, I realized the mistake. The air was thick, suffocating. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the cracked tiles. The stalls were empty, doors hanging open like yawning mouths. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. The soft, deliberate click of the restroom door locking behind me. Panic surged through me as I spun around, trying to force the door open. It wouldn't budge. My breath came in shallow gasps as I heard something wet. A slow, rhythmic dripping sound echoing from the farthest stall. Drip, drip, drip. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I stepped closer. The stall door creaked open. Inside was a single sodden shoe, women's, pale yellow, crusted with mud, and beneath it, a pool of thick, dark liquid that oozed outward, spreading like ink on paper. It wasn't water. The lights cut out entirely. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall as a low, guttural growl reverberated through the room. It wasn't human. It was behind me. I spun around, and for the briefest of moments, I saw it. A silhouette, tall, impossibly gaunt, its limbs contorted like broken branches, and its face. I'll never forget that face. Eyes too large for its skull, reflecting the faintest hint of light, and a smile carved unnaturally wide. Then, darkness. When I woke, I was outside, lying on the cold asphalt of the parking lot. My car door was wide open, and the engine was running. The clock read 4:47 a.m. The other car? Gone. The rest stop? Silent, as though it had never stirred. I didn't wait to investigate further. I climbed into the driver's seat and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner to gather my wits. The waitress asked if I was all right, said I looked pale as a ghost. Just a bad night, I muttered, glancing up at the wall-mounted TV. The local news was on, reporting on a missing woman last seen wearing a pale yellow shoe. The broadcast cut to her photo, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was the woman from the car. I didn't finish my coffee at the diner. My hands were shaking too much, and my stomach churned every time I glanced back at the screen. The photo of the missing woman stared back at me like an accusation. I wasn't sure what scared me more, what I'd seen or the thought that maybe I'd been dragged into something bigger than I could comprehend. Still, there was no way I could let it end there. I needed answers. The next morning, I retraced my route. The rest stop wasn't far, but as I drove, doubt gnawed at me. What was I doing? Trying to convince myself it wasn't real? Or maybe that it was, and I wasn't losing my mind. I kept telling myself it was just a dream, a trick of exhaustion and fear, until I pulled back into the lot, and it was gone. Not abandoned or empty, gone. The cracked asphalt, the picnic tables, even the restroom building, all of it had vanished. The only thing left was an overgrown patch of dirt and weeds, as though the place had been erased from existence. But my tire marks were still there, faint but undeniable, leading to nowhere. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the void. That's when I saw it. A piece of yellow fabric snagged on a nearby branch, fluttering in the wind. I didn't want to get out of the car. Every nerve in my body screamed to leave, to forget, but I couldn't. Not after last night. The fabric was part of a shoe, torn and stained, just like the one I'd seen in the restroom. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Across the field, a figure emerged from the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, its gait unnatural like a puppet, being yanked along by invisible strings. It wore the remains of a suit, its fabric torn and hanging loose around a skeletal frame. The head tilted at an impossible angle, and those eyes, Those same reflective eyes, too large, too bright. I slammed the car into reverse, heart hammering as I fumbled to pull away. But the figure didn't chase me. It just watched, its head swiveling unnaturally as I sped off down the road. And then, just as I rounded the bend, it raised one spindly hand and waved. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow felt too dark, every sound in the night too deliberate. I kept checking the news for updates about the missing woman, but her story faded into the background, replaced by newer tragedies and scandals. No one ever found her. Eventually, I sold the car. I couldn't sit in it without feeling that oppressive silence, the memory of that place seeping into my skin. But even that didn't help. The dreams started soon after. Dreams of the rest stop, of the yellow shoe, of those eyes staring back at me from the trees, and the whispers. They never stopped. I wish I could say it ended there, that I moved on and forgot about it. But late at night when I'm alone, I still hear them. The whispers, soft, unintelligible, but always there. And sometimes, when I'm driving long stretches of highway, I catch glimpses of something in the rearview mirror, a shape too tall, too gaunt, with eyes that glow just a little too brightly, and I know it's waiting for someone else to stop, for someone else to see, and for them to never leave. I didn't believe the warnings at first. I mean, who listens to whispers about a desolate highway anyway? But this wasn't just any road. It was Ridgeway Stretch, a winding path through the middle of nowhere. My night shift had just ended, and my brain was buzzing too much for a straight route home. Something about the idea of open roads under a pitch-black sky seemed soothing. I should have stayed on the main road. It started harmless enough. The hum of my car, the faint rhythm of late-night radio, and the vast emptiness stretching ahead. But something felt off. The moon, which had been full and bright, vanished behind clouds, plunging the world into a darkness so thick my headlights barely made a dent. Then I saw it. A figure on the side of the road, just standing there. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood still like they were carved out of the darkness itself. Something about the way they leaned slightly forward felt wrong, like gravity was holding them in place unnaturally. My instinct screamed, "Keep driving." So I did. But as my car rolled past, the headlights flickered, and I swear I saw the figure twist its head to watch me. Only there were no eyes, just hollow pits. My chest tightened, and I floored the gas pedal. The car roared forward, the speedometer climbing past 70, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The road felt endless, curving in ways it hadn't before, twisting like a serpent. My GPS blinked out, replacing my destination with static. That's when the radio crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, seeped through the speakers. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I nearly swerved off the road as the voice hissed through the car's speakers. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was rattling my ribs. The radio wasn't even turned on. I'd switched it off minutes ago, fed up with static. But here it was, alive and taunting me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Long shift, dark road, adrenaline. Classic ingredients for a good scare. That's all it was. At least, that's what I told myself until my headlights caught movement up ahead. Something darted across the road, low and fast, like an animal. I slammed the brakes hard, skidding to a stop. The silence afterward was deafening. My car idled in the middle of the stretch, headlights illuminating nothing but empty asphalt, and the distant shimmer of mist. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from above. I froze, staring at the roof of the car. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like nails scratching at metal. My breath hitched as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The interior was pitch black, but for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind me, a subtle shift of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Gripping the wheel tighter, I slammed the car into gear and sped off. The tapping stopped instantly, but the relief didn't last. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Look in the mirror. I didn't want to. God help me, I didn't want to. But my eyes betrayed me, flickering up to the rear view. The shadow was back, but now it had form. A figure hunched low, its head almost brushing the roof. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it staring at me, the weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. No, I whispered, shaking my head, as if denying it could make it disappear. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The engine whined, the car shuddering as it hit 90, then 100. The road narrowed, trees closing in like a tunnel, their branches clawing at the sides of my car. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. Then, in a voice that sounded like rusted metal scraping glass, it whispered, "You can't outrun it." I screamed, swerving wildly. The car clipped something, a signpost or maybe a guardrail, and spun out. Time slowed as the world flipped. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I was going to die. But I didn't. When the car finally stopped rolling, I was upside down, hanging by the seatbelt. Blood dripped from a gash on my forehead, my breaths shallow and rapid. The silence was suffocating. I fumbled with the buckle, crashing down onto the cracked windshield. Every muscle in my body screamed as I crawled out of the wreckage. The night was eerily calm. My car lay in a mangled heap, steam hissing from the engine. The road was gone. I wasn't on Ridgeway Stretch anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Around me was an endless expanse of fog, shifting like it was alive. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, growing closer. I turned, my legs trembling, and saw the figure emerge from the mist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "What do you want?" I screamed, backing away. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with a hand that wasn't a hand. It was more like a claw, made of shadows. And then, it spoke. "You left the road. Now you belong to me." I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The clock read 7:06 a.m. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, warm and familiar. It was just a nightmare, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as I sat up, my body aching, I realized something was wrong. The clothes I was wearing were the same ones from the night before, torn and stained with blood. My car keys were still in my pocket, sticky with grime, and etched into the palm of my hand, as if burned there, were 3 words: "Don't come back." I haven't driven at night since, and if you're ever tempted to take Ridgeway Stretch for a shortcut, let me save you the trouble. Whatever's out there, it doesn't like visitors. The highway was empty, except for my old sedan cutting through the cold, humid night. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred as I sped up, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Every so often, my headlights would catch the silhouette of a road sign or an old skeletal tree, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the cracked pavement. I shouldn't have taken that detour. It started as a routine trip home. Work had bled into the late hours, and I'd left the office with nothing on my mind but getting back to bed. The regular route was closed, some roadwork or an accident. I didn't pay attention. My GPS offered an alternative, a back road that wound through what looked like endless farmland and forest. At first, the dark quiet was soothing, almost peaceful. But then I noticed something unsettling, a shape in the rearview mirror, a light, faint at first, blinking intermittently far behind me. I slowed down, expecting it to vanish like a trick of the eye, but it didn't. It grew stronger, steadier, a single glaring white orb bouncing over the road, speeding closer. At the next intersection, I turned off without hesitation, tires screeching against the asphalt. The road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side, and the light disappeared. I let out a shaky breath. Probably just another driver, I told myself. A farmer or a trucker, out late. That's when the radio crackled. It was off. I was sure of it. Off and silent, like it had been all night. But now it hissed, faint voices slipping in and out of static. I glanced at the dashboard, confused, and almost didn't notice the figure in the road until it was too late. It appeared so suddenly, my chest tightened. A man stood directly in my path, his hand raised like he was signaling me to stop. I slammed the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. Heart pounding, I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The man was pale, unnaturally so, his face hollow and his clothes rumpled. He didn't look homeless, though, or drunk, more like something misplaced. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. My gut told me to drive, but curiosity won. I cracked the window. "What are you doing out here?" I called, my voice shaking more than I liked. The man's lips stopped moving, his head tilted, neck bending in an unnatural angle. Then, in a voice as clear as if he were sitting beside me, he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Every instinct screamed to press the gas and go, but my body froze. It wasn't just fear. It was something heavier, like the air had thickened, rooting me to the spot. Then the man moved, not toward me, backward. His feet shuffled awkwardly as he retreated into the shadows, his figure melting into the trees. The radio hissed louder now, the static broken by faint guttural sounds that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Before I could act, the light reappeared in my rearview mirror. This time it wasn't distant. It flooded the inside of my car, so bright it washed out the world outside. My foot found the pedal, and I sped off, the light chasing me like a predator. I floored the gas pedal, the old sedan groaning as it sped down the winding road. The blinding light in my rearview mirror didn't falter. It grew brighter, closer, swallowing the world behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and the forest on either side blurred into an endless wall of black. The radio screamed now. No music, just static and garbled voices, as if 100 people were shouting underwater. The sound clawed at my brain, making it hard to think. I reached for the dial, desperate to shut it off, but it wouldn't budge. A figure appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the road again. It wasn't the man from before. It was taller, thinner, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head lolled to the side as if it couldn't hold it up. And its eyes, God, its eyes glowed the same blinding white as the light behind me. I yanked the wheel to the left, narrowly avoiding it, and felt the car's tires hit gravel. My heart stopped as the vehicle skidded, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands. I was certain I'd crash into a tree, but the car swerved back onto the road as if pulled by an invisible force. That was when I heard the laughter. It wasn't from the radio or the road. It came from inside the car. I didn't dare look around. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, where the forest began to thin, revealing a stretch of open field. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, echoing in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was mocking or joyous, but it chilled me to my core. "Keep driving," a voice whispered from the passenger seat. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over. The passenger seat was empty, but for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to shift, forming a faint outline of a figure hunched over, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its presence pressed on me like a physical weight. The light in the rearview mirror was gone now, but I didn't dare slow down. My car roared across the field, the tires thumping over uneven ground. The open space should have felt like relief, but the darkness here was heavier, more oppressive. It swallowed the stars and the moon, leaving only my dim headlights cutting through the void. Then my engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car jerked forward but lost speed, its protests growing louder with each passing second. Finally, it rolled to a stop, the engine clicking as it died. The headlights flickered, then went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. For a long moment, there was silence, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dirt behind me. My breath hitched, my entire body trembling. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on its flashlight, but it slipped from my hands and fell somewhere under the seat. The footsteps stopped. A faint glow appeared in the distance, the same orb of light I'd seen earlier. It hovered, pulsating like a heartbeat, and slowly began to move toward me. I scrambled out of the car, my legs weak, my body screaming to run, but unable to obey. The orb floated closer, illuminating the field in its eerie, shifting glow. And then I saw them. Figures stood all around me, their outlines faint and flickering, like static on an old TV. They were just outside the orb's reach, encircling me. Their faces were blank, no features, no eyes, just smooth, pale surfaces that tilted toward me as if watching. The orb stopped a few feet away, hovering in the air. I stared at it, mesmerized, as it began to change. Its light dimmed, revealing a swirling, gas-like surface that twisted and turned. The figures stepped closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. I forced myself to move, stumbling backward. My hand brushed against something cold and metal. The car's door. Without thinking, I climbed back inside and locked the doors, as if that could protect me. The orb didn't follow. Instead, it began to stretch and shift, forming a long, thin shape that resembled an arm. The limb extended toward the car, its fingers tapping gently on the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a single clear voice. "Run." The orb exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I screamed, shielding my eyes. When I dared to look again, the figures were gone. The field was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of my engine sputtering back to life. I didn't question it. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not caring where the road led, as long as it was away. The orb's glow lingered in my rearview mirror for miles, like a distant star, before finally fading into the night. I made it home just before dawn, my hands still trembling as I shut the door behind me. Sleep didn't come that morning, or the next night. I still see the orb sometimes, in the corner of my vision, when I'm driving alone, and I never ever take the back roads anymore. It's a quiet November night, and you're driving along a winding country road, the kind that feels endless, flanked by skeletal trees clawing at the dark sky. The kind of night where even the stars seem to shy away, leaving you under a dome of oppressive blackness. Your high beams carve a narrow path ahead, illuminating only the cold asphalt and the occasional reflector post. You weren't supposed to take this road, but the GPS rerouted you due to an accident on the interstate, and now you're here, on this godforsaken road, miles from anywhere. And then you see it, a figure. It's standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by your headlights. Instinctively, your foot eases off the accelerator. They're not waving you down, not signaling for help. They're just standing there, facing the road, facing you. Your brain tries to rationalize it. Maybe it's a stranded motorist, a jogger. But why here? Why now? The figure doesn't move. It's when you draw closer that the dread sets in. They're dressed in a coat far too light for the weather, their head hanging at an angle that makes your neck hurt just looking at it. You squint, heart hammering. Their face is obscured, shadowed, or maybe featureless. Your gut screams at you to keep driving. Just keep going. Don't stop. But something, some damnable magnetic pull, makes you slow down. You stop the car about 20 feet away. The figure doesn't react. It's as if they don't notice your car or don't care. You flick on your brights, flooding the road with light, and they're gone. No, not gone. Moved. You see them now, but they're off the road, deeper into the trees, standing just at the edge of the beam's reach, still as a statue watching. You don't know why, but you roll down the window just a crack. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's that human instinct to do the worst possible thing in a dangerous situation. Your voice feels small in the yawning silence. Hey, you need help? No response. The figure doesn't move, but the trees behind them sway slightly in the wind, or at least you think it's the wind. It's hard to tell because you hear nothing. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just the engine's low growl and your own breathing, sharp and uneven. You start to second-guess yourself. Maybe you imagined them moving off the road. Maybe your tired brain is playing tricks. But then your headlights flicker. Not off, not entirely, but enough to make your stomach drop. The beams dim for a split second, and when they come back, the figure is closer. Much closer. They're at the edge of the ditch now, their face, or the void where their face should be, angled directly at you. Your chest tightens as you realize you can't make out any features. No eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth expanse of pale skin. And then you notice something else. Their hands. Long. Wrong. Like talons, hanging just a little too low, the fingers unnaturally thin and curling slightly, as if they're waiting to grasp something. Your survival instincts kick in. You slam the window shut and put the car in gear. You're not staying here. Not tonight. Not for anyone or anything. The tires screech as you take off, but as the car lurches forward, you feel a weight, a pressure, like someone's holding the back of the car, the rear view mirror. You know you shouldn't look, but your eyes dart to it anyway, and they're there, perched on the trunk, their hands splayed out against the glass, fingers stretching impossibly long. They're still featureless, but you swear you can feel them looking at you. Through you. You scream and stomp the gas. The car roars, the tires find grip, and for a second, you think you're free. The figure slides off the back, disappearing into the dark road behind you. Relief washes over you in a cold wave, but then something taps the window. Once, twice, a rhythmic knock, deliberate and unhurried. It's coming from the passenger side. You whip your head around. The figure is sitting in the seat beside you, impossibly calm, hands resting on their knees like they've been there the whole time. The inside of the car reeks now, like wet earth and decay. You don't even think. You wrench the wheel to the side. The car fishtails, and you barely manage to keep it from rolling as it screeches to a halt in the middle of the road. You throw open the door and bolt into the woods, leaving the car behind. Branches slash at your arms and face as you run, You don't know where you're going, but anywhere is better than here. The figure doesn't chase you, at least not in the way you expect. You can't see them, but you feel them. Their presence is heavy, like the air is pressing down on you. Every shadow seems alive, every sound amplified. Finally, you burst into a clearing and collapse to your knees. The moonlight bathes the open space, giving you the first sense of security you've felt all night. You take a moment to catch your breath, the cold seeping into your skin as you sit there trembling. And then you hear it. The knock. Once, twice. You whip around, and there, at the edge of the clearing, the figure stands. Only now, they're not alone. Dozens of them emerge from the trees, identical and featureless, their long fingers curling and uncurling as they close in. They form a perfect circle around you, their movements synchronized, their heads tilting in unison. Your scream catches in your throat as they close the gap, their smooth faces mere inches from yours. And then, blackness. When you wake up, you're in your car. It's parked neatly at the gas station you stopped at before this nightmare began. The sun is rising, the orange glow spilling over the horizon. The engine is off, your keys in your lap. Everything looks normal, except for the muddy handprint smeared across your windshield. The evening air was thick with the smell of wet hay and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The wind carried a strange, almost melodic whistling sound that seemed to rise and fall, as if it was alive and moving just beyond the edge of the cornfield. That's where I was, alone on my grandfather's farm for the weekend. He'd left a list of chores, but I was mostly there to keep an eye on the livestock. Easy enough. It started with the chickens. Around midnight, I heard them squawking, not their usual restless chatter, but a frenzied, chaotic scream that shot me bolt upright in bed. Grabbing the flashlight by the door, I shoved my feet into my boots and headed out. The barnyard was quiet, except for the frantic rustling inside the coop. When I opened the door, my stomach twisted. Something had ripped through the chicken wire, leaving a gaping hole. Feathers floated in the air like soft snow, and the floor was littered with streaks of blood. There were no tracks outside, just the hole and the silence. Too much silence. Even the frogs in the pond weren't croaking. I convinced myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By 2 a.m., the rain started, a steady, cold drizzle. I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, when the faint sound of movement reached my ears. It wasn't coming from the house, but from somewhere outside. It was a low, dragging sound, punctuated by wet thuds, as if something heavy was being pulled through the mud. I hesitated for too long before grabbing the shotgun from the rack. As I stepped outside, the rain soaked me instantly, plastering my shirt to my skin. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the silo. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered planks dark against the stormy sky. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the rain, knocking loose a tarp. But as I approached, the dragging sound stopped. I swung the flashlight beam towards the base of the silo. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over the pile of spilled corn, its arms long and bony, the skin stretched tight over sharp joints. Its back was to me, but its movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze, the beam of light shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever it was, it turned its head slowly, unnaturally far, until its face was visible in profile. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. It grinned, a thin, split-lipped smile that made my knees buckle. And then it stood. It was tall, too tall. It had to duck as it turned fully towards me, In its clawed hand, it held a chicken, what was left of one. It dropped the carcass, and the wet thud echoed in the silence. The thing started towards me, its movements fluid now, almost hypnotic. I ran. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted back to the house. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the wet slapping of its footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the door, I was screaming. I slammed it shut, bolting the lock and shoving the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. The porch creaked as it stepped up, and I could hear it sniffing, the sound wet and guttural. Then, nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, the shotgun cradled in my arms, the flashlight trained on the door. It didn't return. Not that night. But the farm wasn't the same after that. Strange things kept happening. The cows refused to graze near the silo, and I found deep clawed marks gouged into the barn doors. And every night, without fail, that melodic whistling would drift through the air, growing louder as it approached the house. I left that farm the next morning, my chores undone. I never told my grandfather what happened. I didn't have to. When he called me weeks later, his voice was shaking. He said something was out there, something that didn't belong. He never saw it, but he heard the whistling. He sold the farm not long after that. Last I heard, the new owners abandoned it after their son disappeared. They said he was playing near the silo. I know better. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the farm and the horrors stayed there, tied to the land like a bad dream. But things like that don't let go so easily. They follow you. They linger. A few months after I left, I moved to the city, hoping the crowded streets and constant hum of life would drown out the memories. It worked for a while. I even started sleeping better, the image of that grinning, hollow-eyed thing fading with time. Then, one night, I heard it again. I was walking home late, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural in a city. I'd just turned a corner when I heard it. The whistling, that same melodic tune, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind back on the farm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was faint, almost playful, coming from somewhere up ahead. Slowly, I turned my head. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, it stepped into the light. It was the same as before, tall, gangly, its skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift and crack as it moved. Its eyes locked on mine, black and endless, and it smiled that impossible smile. But now, it was wearing something. A tattered flannel shirt and overalls, smeared with mud and blood, as if mocking the life I'd tried to leave behind. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it began to move. Not running, not lunging, but walking, slow and deliberate, each step a taunt. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The streets blurred as I sprinted, my lungs burning with each gasp of icy air. The whistling followed, growing louder, closer, no matter how fast I ran. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the city seemed empty, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone with that thing. Finally, I spotted an old church, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron bolt into place. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the whistling started again, just outside the door. It circled the building, the sound rising and falling as it moved, always just out of sight. I backed away, clutching a heavy candlestick I'd grabbed from the altar. My eyes darted to the stained glass windows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the floor, long and spindly, growing larger as it moved closer to the window. Slowly, its face came into view, distorted by the colored glass, but unmistakable. It pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the window, the claws clicking softly against the pane. And then, it smiled. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I passed out. All I know is that when I woke up, the church was empty, the doors still bolted, and the whistling was gone. But it left something behind. On the floor, in the faint light filtering through the stained glass, was a single feather, blood-stained and torn, just like the ones from the coop on the farm. I moved again after that, farther this time. Different city, different state, but no matter where I go, I hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, that faint, mocking tune, carried on a wind that doesn't belong. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: it's still out there, somewhere, and it's still watching. So, if you're ever out in the countryside and you hear whistling, don't follow it. Don't look for the source. Just run and pray it isn't looking for you. It started with a bet. I was bored, drunk, and feeling invincible when I said I'd spend the night out at Widow's Creek Farm. For years, it had been the town's favorite spooky story, the abandoned farmhouse, where people swore they heard voices, saw shadows moving in the windows. Local legend said the owner, Mr. Eldridge, vanished one night, and no one had been able to buy or sell the property since. Something about the land made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in all that. Armed with a flashlight, a folding chair, and a thermos of coffee, I set out to prove everyone wrong. By the time I got to the farm, the moon was low and hazy, casting just enough light to turn the barn and house into black, jagged silhouettes against the night sky. I parked the truck at the edge of the property and made my way to the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the absolute stillness. Inside, the house smelled like wet rot. My flashlight beam swept over faded wallpaper and furniture covered in sheets. But what struck me was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. Easy, I muttered to myself, setting up my chair in the front room where I had a clear view of the kitchen and stairs. Just a night alone in an old house. The first few hours passed without incident. I tried to stream music, but the signal was dead. That's when I heard it, a faint thud upstairs. My flashlight shot toward the staircase, catching nothing but empty steps. It's just the house settling, I told myself, though my pulse was already quickening. And then, the lantern flickered to life. It was sitting on the kitchen table, a rusty oil lantern I hadn't noticed before. A weak yellow flame danced inside, casting moving shadows on the walls. I froze. There was no one here. No one could have lit it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The lantern flame sputtered as if in response, then settled into a steady glow. I stepped closer, my boots dragging against the warped floorboards. The lantern's glass was clean, the wick trimmed. Someone had been here recently. I turned in a circle, shining my light into every corner of the room, but saw nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the house to the other. My flashlight darted to the ceiling as the sound moved toward the top of the staircase. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. The footsteps stopped. The lantern, sitting on the table just a moment before, was suddenly at the foot of the stairs. Its flame flared brightly, and for a second, I thought I saw something behind it. A shadowy figure, long and thin, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I ran. I bolted out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The truck was parked just a few hundred feet away, but as I ran, the air grew thick. My legs felt heavy, like wading through molasses. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead. The farmhouse was ablaze with light, every window glowing fiercely. Figures stood in the glass, tall, thin shapes that didn't move, just watched as I struggled to breathe. And then the barn door slammed open. Something crawled out of the darkness. It was on all fours, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I screamed and turned back toward the truck, pushing through whatever force was holding me back. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, but the thing was right behind me now. I felt its breath, hot, wet, and rancid, on the back of my neck. Then the truck roared to life. I didn't start it. I wasn't even inside yet. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the creature as it lunged for me. It froze in the bright beams, its skin pale and stretched, its face a featureless mask. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then it shrieked, a sound so high and sharp, it felt like needles stabbing into my ears, and darted back toward the barn. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse lights flicker and die, one by one, until only the lantern remained, glowing faintly on the porch. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I told my friends I'd lost the bet, made up some story about the place being too creepy to stay the whole night. I didn't mention the lantern, the footsteps, or the thing in the barn. I should have forgotten about it. Moved on. But last night, I woke up to find a faint yellow glow in my bedroom. The lantern was on my dresser. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The lantern sat on my dresser, its faint yellow flame steady and unmoving, the same lantern I left behind at Widow's Creek. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I was still out there on the farm, and all of this was a fever dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when dawn broke, the light of the flame didn't dim. It stayed just as bright, a constant reminder that whatever followed me home wasn't leaving. I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what I could and drove. No destination in mind, just miles of asphalt and endless trees. The morning air was crisp, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, the pale, stretched face of whatever came out of that barn. But I was alone, for now. I checked into a motel on the edge of a neighboring town, telling myself this was temporary, that I could figure out what to do next once I got some sleep. But when I opened the room door, my stomach dropped. The lantern was waiting for me on the bedside table. Its flame burned just as steady, casting that sickly yellow glow. I stepped back, leaving the door open, hoping some part of me was imagining it. But when I blinked, it was still there. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room, expecting it to shatter, to douse that damn flame for good. But it didn't break. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, the flame undisturbed. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They came from above me, faint and deliberate, just like they had in the farmhouse. My heart hammered as the sound moved across the ceiling, stopping directly above where I stood. A shadow fell over the bed. It stretched impossibly tall, the head cocked at that same unnatural angle. It wasn't cast by me. It was waiting. I fled the motel. There was no plan now, just an overwhelming need to keep moving. I drove for hours, the highway blurring into a gray monotony. The lantern didn't appear in the car, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd left it behind. Maybe it was over. Then the radio crackled to life. At first it was static, but slowly I started to hear a voice, a low, garbled whisper, almost like it was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. I turned the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the air vents now, from the faint hum of the engine. Widow? Waiting? My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as bone. The voice was clearer now, repeating those same words over and over. Widow, waiting, widow, waiting. It was nearly sunset when the truck broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on a stretch of empty road. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When I finally got out, the landscape around me was unfamiliar. Flat fields stretched out on either side of the road, broken only by the silhouette of a barn in the distance. My blood ran cold. It was Widow's Creek. The truck wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. I was trapped, and I knew I wasn't alone. The lantern was on the hood of the truck now, its light flickering weakly in the dusk. The footsteps started again. They were closer this time, moving with purpose, circling the truck. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My flashlight barely cut through the growing darkness, but I swept it in frantic arcs, trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the fields, their movements slow and jerky. They were tall and thin, their bodies stretched unnaturally, their faces blank slates of pale skin. Dozens of them all converging on the truck. I grabbed the lantern off the hood without thinking, clutching it like it might somehow protect me. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the light. The flame flared brighter, and for a moment, they hesitated. "Leave!" I screamed, holding the lantern high. The figures shrank back, their forms dissolving into the shadows. But the moment didn't last. The flame sputtered, growing dimmer, and they began to move again. Faster this time, closing the distance with unnatural speed. I don't remember how I made it back to the farmhouse, only that I did. The lantern led me, its glow flickering through the dark, guiding me past the barn and into the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, though I knew it wouldn't keep them out. The figures were at the windows now, their faces pressed against the glass. The lantern sat on the table where I'd first found it, its flame burning weakly. And then it spoke. "Burn it," the voice whispered, faint and hollow. "End it." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the floor. The oil spilled out, catching fire immediately. The flames spread fast, consuming the room, the walls, everything. The figures at the windows screamed, their cries high and inhuman, and then they were gone. I ran. The farmhouse burned behind me, a towering inferno that lit up the night. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the house had collapsed in on itself, the flames dying down to embers. I don't know what I unleashed that night, or if I stopped it. The lantern was gone, but its light still haunts me. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the air is still, I catch a faint yellow glow out of the corner of my eye, and I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. The night started like any other, quiet, uneventful, with a slight chill in the air as the moon hung high over the sprawling farmland. I'd agreed to watch over my friend's farm while he and his wife took a rare weekend off. The place was massive, bordered by dense woods on one side and endless cornfields on the other. I was promised nothing more than a cozy guest room and some peace. Instead, I got something I'll never forget. By midnight, the house was silent. The livestock, a handful of cows and a stubborn old mule, were already settled in the barn. I'd finished my last round through the property, locked the doors, and double-checked the generator, since the area was notorious for power outages. All seemed fine. I was halfway into a second beer, flipping channels on an old TV in the living room, when I heard it. A sharp metallic asterisk, clank asterisk, like something striking the barn door. My first thought was, raccoons. They're bold out here. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The yard stretched out into shadows, the barn standing 100 yards from the house, just beyond the motion-activated light's reach. As I stepped closer, the light snapped on. My stomach dropped. The barn door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Raccoons don't do that, I muttered to myself. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dark as I stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and earth, familiar but strangely oppressive that night. The cows were agitated, shifting nervously in their pens, their eyes reflecting the light with unnatural brightness. The mule, usually indifferent to everything, let out a low, uneasy bray from the back corner. "Hello?" I called out, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever, or whatever, was there would just leave if they heard me. No response. Just the sound of animals shifting and the faint creak of the barn's wooden beams. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt floor. Bare, human-like prints. But they were wrong. The toes were too long, almost clawed, and the stride was unnatural, too far apart, like whoever made them was crawling or bounding rather than walking. I followed the tracks to the far corner of the barn, where the mule stood trembling, its ears pinned back. Beyond it was the old ladder that led up to the hayloft. The prints stopped there, but the mule's reaction told me whatever it was hadn't just disappeared. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed to leave, to lock the barn, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ignored it, whatever was lurking up there wouldn't stay contained. I climbed the ladder slowly, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. My flashlight swept across the hayloft. It was empty at first glance, just piles of straw and old tools gathering dust. Then I noticed something odd. In the far corner, where the moonlight filtered through the slats, the hay was matted down, like something had been lying there, and next to it, scratch marks, long, deep grooves in the wood, as if made by claws. That's when I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from above me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The barn had no second story, just the roof beams overhead. Slowly, I tilted the flashlight upward. Something was there, crouched among the beams, its pale limbs impossibly thin and long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but they were too big, too human. It moved suddenly, skittering along the beams like a spider, the clicking sound growing louder as its claws scraped against the wood. I don't remember climbing down. 1 second, I was staring at it, and the next, I was sprinting toward the house, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard, it hurt. The house felt wrong now, like it wasn't safe anymore. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Not unusual for the area, but it felt deliberate. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear it now. The faint asterisk, click, click, click asterisk of claws on the porch outside. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing the only weapon I could find, a rusty hatchet from the fireplace tools. The sound moved to the side of the house, then the back, as if it was circling, testing the walls. Then came the worst sound yet, the creak of a window sliding open upstairs. It was in the house. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that it wouldn't find me. The only option was to face it. Hatchet in hand, I crept up the stairs, every step feeling like it could be my last. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the guest room door slightly ajar. The faint moonlight spilling in showed the curtains fluttering. The window was wide open. The clicking had stopped. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the bedspread was disturbed, claw marks raked across the headboard. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I backed out of the room. That's when I felt it, hot breath against my neck. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly. It caught something, the blade sinking in with a wet asterisk thunk asterisk. A screech filled the air, high-pitched and inhuman. The creature recoiled, its long limbs thrashing as it tried to pull away. I saw it clearly for the first time, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, its face a grotesque mimicry of human features, twisted into something predatory. I didn't stop swinging until it stopped moving. When the sun rose, I buried what was left of it in the woods. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. My friend's farm looks peaceful in the daylight, but I'll never stay there again. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some places aren't meant to be guarded alone. A week after that night, I got a call from my friend. He thanked me for watching the farm and casually asked if I noticed anything strange while I was there. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what happened without sounding insane? Instead of answering directly, I asked why he'd asked. His tone shifted, less casual, more guarded. "Well," he began, "we've been having issues for a while. Strange sounds in the barn, missing animals. Thought maybe it was coyotes or feral dogs. But the footprints we've found don't match anything we know. The neighbors have seen things near the woods." "Things?" I asked, my voice tight. "Yeah, like figures. Too tall, too thin, running on all fours. One of the neighbors swears it looked right at him. They won't come near the property now." He laughed nervously. "Honestly, I figured it was just their imagination until we started losing livestock." I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse quickening. "Why didn't you tell me this before I stayed there?" There was a long pause. "I didn't want to scare you off. Besides, we figured it was just animals. Nothing that'd bother a person, you know?" I didn't respond. My thoughts were spiraling back to that night, to the thing in the barn, its impossible limbs, the way it moved, how it felt too smart, too aware. "Hey," he added, "we're putting the place up for sale. The wife and I decided it's not worth the stress. Whoever buys it can deal with whatever's out there." That was the last time I heard from him. The farm sold within a month, and I heard the new owners moved in without issue. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I tried to convince myself that whatever I'd faced that night was gone, that maybe I'd killed it. But deep down, I knew better. About 3 months later, I was back in the city, starting to feel normal again. Then one evening, as I was locking up my apartment for the night, I heard it. A faint asterisk, click, click, click asterisk, from somewhere in the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, staring at the peephole in my door, expecting to see something staring back. But when I finally worked up the courage to look, the hallway was empty. The sound stopped. But now, every night when it's quiet, I listen for it. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. A soft, rhythmic asterisk, click, click, click asterisk, like claws on wood, like it's waiting for me. And I know one thing for sure, whatever it is, it doesn't stay on the farm. I've never told anyone this before, mostly because I know no one would believe me, and honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself. But I've been haunted by it ever since. Maybe if I write it down, I can let it go. This happened a few years ago. I was doing a solo road trip through the Midwest. I'd planned it as a way to clear my head after a messy breakup. I was hitting every weird roadside attraction I could find. Giant fiberglass animals, tiny museums, old diners. You know, Americana at its quirkiest. It was the middle of nowhere, somewhere on a back road in South Dakota, when my car started making that sound. You know the one. The grinding that makes your stomach drop because you know it's bad. The I'm about to be stranded sound. I pulled over to the side of the road. Nothing but flat fields in every direction. Not a single car had passed me in hours. Cell service? Forget it. I popped the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking at. Just a steaming, hissing mess. And then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I saw it. A beat-up old RV trundling toward me, rattling like it was held together with duct tape and prayer. I waved it down, figuring whoever was inside might have a phone or at least a toolbox. The RV stopped a few feet ahead of my car. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with stringy hair and a faded denim jacket. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, trying not to let the growing unease show on my face. "Car broke down. Got any tools?" He tilted his head, like he was considering. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on a crocodile before it snapped its jaws shut. "I got tools," he said. "Why don't you come inside? Safer than waiting out here in the dark." There was something off about him, but I figured I didn't have much of a choice. I followed him up the rickety steps into the RV. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like meat left out in the sun too long. Inside, it was cluttered. Piles of dirty clothes, tools scattered everywhere, and jars. Lots of jars, all lined up on shelves. Each one was filled with a murky liquid, and floating inside were things. I couldn't tell what they were, but some looked like animal parts. Others, not so much. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out wrenches and pliers. "What brings you out here?" he asked over his shoulder. "Just a road trip," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled. "Not many folks come down this road, not unless they're lost, or looking for something." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I decided I'd grab whatever tools he handed me and get out of there as fast as possible. But before I could say anything, he turned to me, holding a massive wrench. "You ever seen something you can't explain?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "What do you mean?" I asked, backing toward the door. "You know," he said, gesturing to the jars. "Things that don't belong in this world." I glanced at the jars again. One of them had what looked like a human hand inside, only it had too many fingers, and the skin was an unnatural, waxy yellow. "I think I should get back to my car," I said, trying to sound casual. But he blocked the door. "What's the rush? Night's coming, and out here when it gets dark, that's when they come out." "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. He grinned again, wider this time. "The ones that aren't supposed to be here. The ones that used to be human." I pushed past him and stumbled out of the RV, dropping the wrench in the process. I ran back to my car, not daring to look behind me. The engine was still dead, but I didn't care. I locked the doors and sat there, my hands shaking on the wheel. That's when I saw it. Something was moving in the fields. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but then I realized it was standing upright. Tall, too tall, with long, gangly arms that hung almost to the ground. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I wasn't alone. There were more of them, emerging from the tall grass, moving toward the RV, toward me. The man stepped out of the RV, holding something in his hands, a jar, glowing faintly with that same sickly light as their eyes. He held it up, and the creatures stopped. They tilted their heads, watching him, like they were waiting for something. I don't know what happened next. I closed my eyes, praying they wouldn't notice me. When I opened them, the man and the creatures were gone. The RV was still there, its door swinging in the breeze. But the man, the things, gone. I spent the night in my car, too scared to move. By morning, the RV was gone too. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. All I know is, if you're ever driving through South Dakota and your car breaks down, don't accept help from anyone. And if you see something moving in the fields after dark, don't look too closely. I didn't stick around to find out what else might be lurking. As soon as the sun crested the horizon, I jumped out of the car and started walking, following the road in the direction I'd come from. The air felt heavy, like the earth itself wanted to hold me in place, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that RV rumbling after me, or those things slinking through the fields. I must have walked for hours before I saw it. A gas station. It looked ancient, with peeling paint and a sign that barely hung onto its rusted frame. But it was a lifeline. I broke into a jog, relief flooding my chest. The old man behind the counter didn't even look up when I came in, out of breath and wild-eyed. His face was weathered, his skin a deep tan from years under the sun, and he wore a trucker cap pulled low over his forehead. "Morning," he said, chewing on a toothpick. His tone was calm, disinterested, like he saw people like me every day. "My car broke down," I blurted out. "Can I use your phone?" The man squinted at me, then slowly reached under the counter, pulling out an ancient rotary phone. "No cell service out here. Use this." I dialed a tow truck company, stammering out my location as best I could. They told me it'd take a couple of hours to get someone out there. Fine. I could wait. As I hung up, the old man was watching me. His gaze was sharp now, the kind of look that felt like it could peel away your skin to see what was underneath. "You come down from the East Road?" he asked, voice low. I nodded. "See anything strange?" I hesitated, not sure how to answer. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "I mean, did you see them?" I froze. My stomach turned to ice. The man sighed and shook his head. "You're lucky you made it here. Most folks don't. Not when they're out after dark." "What are they?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, walked over to the window, and peered out at the empty road. A long time ago, this place wasn't just farmland. There was something here, something bad. The old folks called it the Hollow, said it was a place where the world didn't sit right, where the line between this world and other things was thin. He turned back to me, his face grim. People built over it, figured they could just bury it and move on. But you can't bury something like that. It stays. It waits. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The man in the RV, does he have something to do with it? The old man's eyes darkened. If you saw him, you're lucky you got away. He's not a man. Not anymore. I wanted to ask more, but the distant rumble of an engine cut me off. The tow truck pulled into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. I thanked the old man and hurried out, eager to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever had happened out there. The tow truck driver was chatty at first, but when I told him where my car had broken down, he went quiet. He didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. We got back to the nearest town, and I left my car at a local mechanic. I thought about telling someone, maybe the cops, but what would I even say? That I'd seen monsters in a field, that a man with jars full of nightmares had invited me into his RV. No one would believe me. I bought a bus ticket back home and didn't look back. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the fields, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And every time, my chest tightens, and I grip the wheel a little harder. I don't take back roads anymore. I don't stop for strangers. And I never, ever look too closely at what might be watching from the dark. Because I know, deep down, that the hollow is still out there, and some roads should never be traveled. The tires hummed against the asphalt as I drove down the endless stretch of highway, a black ribbon cutting through the vast desert. I was on the third day of my road trip, a solo journey I planned to clear my head and escape the monotony of my 9-to-5. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a cathartic drive through America's forgotten backroads, listening to music and collecting memories. But everything changed that night. I had just passed a rusted green sign reading Sandorian, 30 miles, when I noticed the gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. The needle was almost kissing the E, and my GPS, though barely functional in the desert, showed no gas stations nearby. I cursed under my breath and leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, a sign of civilization. It wasn't a gas station. The glow belonged to an old diner, sitting at the edge of nowhere. Its neon sign flickered, spelling "Dine and Shine" in a dull orange light. Relief flooded through me. At least it was a place to stop, ask for directions, and maybe buy a cup of coffee while I planned my next move. I pulled into the gravel lot, my headlights sweeping across a couple of dusty trucks and an old station wagon. The diner looked as tired as the vehicles parked outside. A bell jingled above the door as I entered, and I was hit with the smell of stale grease and coffee, so burnt it seemed aggressive. The diner was empty except for the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and a single customer sitting at the far corner booth. The man didn't look up as I walked in, his face obscured by a hood. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and explained my gas situation to the waitress. She nodded, lips pressed tight, and pointed to an old payphone by the restrooms. "You can call Manny," she said. "He's got a gas can and lives nearby. Charges a bit extra for the trouble, though." I thanked her, but before I could move, the hooded man turned his head slightly in my direction. His eyes glinted like wet asphalt in the dim light. I froze. "Don't bother," he said softly. His voice was low and gravelly. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." I chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. "Why's that?" I asked. The man leaned back, the shadows swallowing his face again. "You just won't?" The waitress shot him a sharp look, muttered something under her breath, and walked to the back kitchen, leaving me alone in the awkward silence. I glanced at the man's booth. Empty plates were stacked neatly in front of him, but his hands were out of sight beneath the table. He was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. I decided to take my chances and called Manny. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Dine and Shine Diner? I'll be there in 20. Don't go anywhere." When I returned to my seat, the hooded man was gone. The door hadn't jingled. I turned to the waitress, who had just come back from the kitchen. "Where'd the guy go?" She frowned. "What guy?" I stared at her, my skin prickling. "The guy in the corner booth. Hooded sweatshirt, he..." She cut me off. "We don't get many visitors here this time of night. You're the only one who's come in." I glanced at the corner booth again. The plates were gone. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I decided to wait outside for Manny. The desert was eerily quiet. No wind, no distant hum of wildlife, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign. The stars were brilliant overhead, but even their beauty couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching on the gravel behind the diner. I turned quickly, expecting to see Manny, or maybe the hooded man. There was no one. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the building slowly, deliberately. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps paused. Then they started again, faster this time. They were coming toward me. I backed up against my car, heart pounding, fumbling for my keys. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just around the corner of the diner. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. A shadow moved at the edge of my headlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something from a fever dream. It didn't move like a person, more like a marionette with broken strings. And then it stopped, standing just at the edge of the light, as if it knew the glow was a barrier it couldn't cross. I didn't wait to find out. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered. The shadow moved closer. I twisted the key again, praying, pleading. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. My heart was racing as I sped down the empty highway, the diner's neon sign shrinking in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, something gnawed at me. The man's words in the diner. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." The thought struck me like a hammer. He hadn't said I couldn't. He said I wouldn't. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. That's when I saw it. The shadow wasn't at the diner anymore. It was in my back seat. I slammed on the brakes so hard, the tires screeched, sending the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the desolate highway. My breathing was erratic, my chest heaving like I'd just sprinted a mile. The rearview mirror quivered as the car settled, but the shadow in the back seat didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My eyes locked on the mirror, sweat dripping down my temple. The shadow was just there. A formless dark mass that seemed to pulse and shift like smoke caught in a vacuum. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer. No movement. Just silence. Gathering every ounce of courage I didn't think I had, I slowly turned my head. The back seat was empty. Relief rushed over me so violently that I almost laughed. Almost. I straightened in my seat, rubbed my temples, and tried to shake off the terror as the absurdity of it all settled in. Sleep deprivation, I thought, my mind playing tricks on me. I put the car back into gear and continued driving. The headlights pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but endless road and desert, stretching into oblivion. Yet, no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy thing again. But it was just me, and the yawning void of the highway behind me. Then the radio crackled. The static came out of nowhere, cutting through the silence like a razor. I hadn't even realized the radio was on, and when I reached to turn it off, a voice emerged. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. Turn around. My blood froze. I ripped the knob off the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, the static more aggressive. Turn around. The dashboard lights flickered, and the car shuddered, as if something massive had latched onto it. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, and I sped down the highway, adrenaline coursing through me. And then the headlights died. Darkness swallowed the car whole. I couldn't see the road, the desert, or even my own hands gripping the steering wheel. The world dissolved into pitch black, and the only sound was the frantic thrum of my heart. Turn around. The voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was coming from the passenger seat. I couldn't help myself. I turned. What I saw wasn't human. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing a sickly yellow, like lanterns in a fog. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They were fixed on me with an intensity that felt like it could peel back my skin and see everything beneath. Its face was wrong, shifting and changing, like trying to hold water in your hands. At one moment, it had a gaping, toothy grin. The next, its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, as if it could swallow the car whole. And those eyes, they never moved, never faltered. They burned into me, drilling into my mind, paralyzing me. "Why are you running?" it asked, its voice overlapping with itself, both a whisper and a roar. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was locked, frozen in terror. The creature's hand, or what passed for a hand, reached out. Long skeletal fingers stretched toward me, their tips curling like talons. I thought this was it, that I was done for, that I would die here on this God-forsaken highway, my body never found. But then, the car jerked violently. The headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was barreling straight toward a sharp turn. I yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding plummeting into a rocky ravine. The tires screeched, the car swerved, and I came to a stop, my chest heaving, tears streaming down my face. When I looked back to the passenger seat, it was empty. The voice was gone. The static was gone. The road was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The shadow, the eyes, the voice, they were real. I knew it. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my entire body trembling with fear. I couldn't stay on that highway. I had to get to Sandorian, no matter what. I pressed the gas, driving as fast as the car could go without flying off the road. The desert began to change. The air grew colder, the stars above dimmer. The world felt heavier, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. Then I saw it, a sign up ahead. Sandorian, 5 miles. Relief surged through me. I was close. I could make it. But as I passed the sign, something moved in the corner of my eye. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadow was back. It wasn't just in the back seat this time. It filled the car, seeping into every corner like an inky mist. The voice returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." The car began to spin. I tried to control it, but the wheel was unresponsive. The shadow swirled around me, thick and suffocating. My vision blurred, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of darkness and sound. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was parked at the entrance to Sandorian. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the small abandoned town. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. The shadow was gone. I stepped out of the car, the morning air crisp and quiet. But as I stood there, staring at the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever followed me was still watching, waiting. The road trip was over, but the terror wasn't. I hate long drives at night. There's something about the dark highway stretching endlessly ahead, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights, that gets under my skin. But this trip couldn't wait. My boss had been clear. Either deliver the package to the facility upstate by morning, or don't bother coming in on Monday. So there I was, cruising down an empty interstate at 2 a.m., miles from anywhere. The radio spitting static because even the FM signals seemed too afraid to linger here. My GPS kept glitching, and my phone battery was draining unnaturally fast, despite being plugged in. Not great. It started with a shadow. I first saw it in my rearview mirror, a flicker just beyond the reach of my taillights. At 60 miles per hour, it shouldn't have been possible for anything to move that fast. Yet, there it was. Something humanoid, with limbs too long and angular to belong to a person, darting across the lane behind me. I brushed it off. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. A trick of the light. But then it darted closer, sticking to the shoulder, like it was stalking me. It didn't feel like a hallucination anymore. Still, I kept driving. Slowing down wasn't an option, and there was no way I was pulling over to investigate. Not here. Not in the middle of nowhere. The radio clicked off suddenly. Silence. And that's when the thing hit my car. The impact slammed me forward, and my tires screeched as I veered into the opposite lane, narrowly missing a guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to control the wheel. What the hell was that? When I stopped the car and stepped out, it was so quiet I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The back of my car had a huge dent, like something heavy had crashed into it. But there was no debris, no animal carcass, nothing. I scanned the area, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too fragile, against the oppressive quiet. Something answered. The response came as a whisper. No, not a whisper, a movement. From the edge of the flashlight's beam, something crawled into view. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its body was gaunt and pale, stretched thin over jagged bones, with skin that gleamed unnaturally under the light. It moved low to the ground, its spindly limbs clicking like branches in a storm. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, except for a faint suggestion of eyes, black and sunken deep into the skull. I froze. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it opened its mouth, or rather, it split. A gash ran down the center of its head, peeling back to reveal rows of teeth, jagged and glistening. It let out a sound like metal scraping against stone. I bolted back to my car. As I slammed the door shut, the thing lunged. Its body smacked against my windshield, its claws raking the glass. I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as I sped off, the creature clinging to the hood. It began pounding on the windshield, spiderweb cracks forming under its blows. My heart raced as I swerved, trying to throw it off. But the thing held firm, its mouth gaping wider, that awful screeching sound cutting through the roar of the engine. I saw a turn up ahead, a sharp bend that veered into a dirt road. I didn't think. I cranked the wheel hard and braced myself as the car skidded. The creature lost its grip, flung violently into the ditch, but my relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw it rise. Slowly, its limbs cracked and twisted unnaturally as it stood taller now, towering over the roadside brush. and it was running after me. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the dirt road slowed me down. The car bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. I could hear it, behind me, gaining. Then up ahead, I saw it. A tunnel. An old, decrepit bridge I hadn't seen on the GPS earlier. I didn't care. It was my only option. The tunnel swallowed me in darkness as I barreled through. My headlights flickered and sputtered, but I kept going, heart pounding. The creature's footsteps faded behind me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then the lights on my dashboard went out. The engine sputtered. The car rolled to a stop. "No," I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I reached for my phone, but it was dead too. The battery inexplicably drained. The silence in the tunnel was suffocating. And then, a sound. A wet, slithering noise, echoing off the tunnel walls. It was here. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, hands shaking, and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I swept the beam around. The creature stood at the far end of the tunnel, only it wasn't alone anymore. Figures emerged from the shadows, their gaunt, pale forms crawling on all fours, their eyeless faces turned toward me in unison. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. They didn't. The first one moved toward me, slow at first, then faster, its claws clicking against the concrete. I swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam did nothing to slow it down. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the tunnel, the creatures chasing me, their guttural screeches bouncing off the walls. I could see the faint glow of moonlight ahead, the tunnel's exit looming closer, but so were they. One of them lunged, claws raking my shoulder. I stumbled, but adrenaline kept me moving. I burst out of the tunnel into the open air, and then, silence. I turned back, expecting to see them still chasing me, but the tunnel was empty. I stood there panting, my shoulder bleeding, heart hammering in my chest. They were gone, or at least, they wouldn't leave the tunnel. I didn't wait to find out why. I staggered to the highway, flagged down a trucker, and left my car, and that place, behind. But the tunnel didn't leave me. When I close my eyes at night, I hear the clicking, the scraping. I see those empty faces, waiting, watching. And sometimes when the room is quiet enough, I think I hear them whispering my name. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods, no distractions, just me, a few books, and the endless sound of leaves brushing against the wind. I had rented the place off a small website that specialized in remote getaways. No ratings, no reviews, but the photos sold me. It looked peaceful, and God knows I needed peace. I arrived just before sunset, and everything seemed perfect. The cabin stood in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines that swallowed most of the sky. There was a creek nearby, and the air smelled of moss and damp earth. Inside, it was cozy, a wood-burning stove, a single bed, and an old oak table by a window overlooking the woods. But the first oddity, the key wasn't where the owner said it would be. The email instructions were clear. Keys under the mat. It wasn't. I ended up finding it inside the mailbox, and while that wasn't too strange, it still gave me pause. Who leaves keys in a mailbox? Shaking it off, I unlocked the door, dropped my bag, and settled in. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, I was already sipping a cup of tea and flipping through a novel. It felt like the beginning of the tranquility I'd been chasing. That peace didn't last long. Just as darkness enveloped the cabin, I heard the sound, a faint rhythmic tapping. I froze, straining my ears. It came from the window by the oak table, a soft yet deliberate knock, knock, knock. as if someone, or something, was using a single finger to tap the glass. I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there. Just blackness. No moonlight, no stars. Just an impenetrable void. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a branch, and forced my attention back to the book. The tapping stopped, but 5 minutes later, it started again. This time, from the front door. I didn't get up. Something deep in my gut told me not to. Instead, I grabbed my phone and checked for signal. No bars. Figures. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The tapping ceased. A long silence followed. Then, as if it was mocking me, the sound moved to the back door. Knock, knock, knock. I wanted to laugh at how cliché it was. I even muttered to myself, "You're imagining things." But I knew I wasn't. The sound was too real, too calculated. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and approached the back door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, the beam of light jittering across the wood. When I finally opened it, there was nothing. Just darkness and the quiet hum of the forest. Then I looked down. Footprints. They weren't human. The prints were elongated, with claw-like marks digging into the soft dirt. My heart dropped. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the blackness of the trees. I slammed the door and locked it. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave, but my car was parked half a mile down the dirt road. No way was I walking through those woods at night. I decided to wait it out, sitting in the middle of the room with every light in the cabin on. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No more tapping, no more footprints. By 3 a.m., I convinced myself I'd overreacted, that it was probably an animal, and I was being ridiculous. I managed to fall asleep. Then I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint, shallow, and right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't even breathe myself. My eyes darted to the clock. 4:13 a.m. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and then something scraped against the window. My stomach churned as the scraping turned to a low, guttural growl. I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I crept out of bed, moving silently toward the window. I positioned myself just out of sight, and with one swift motion, pulled back the curtain. The flashlight beam revealed a face. It wasn't human. The skin was pale, stretched tightly over a skull-like structure. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting the beam like polished obsidian. The mouth, filled with jagged teeth, was impossibly wide, and it twisted into something that could only be described as a grin. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as the creature lunged at the glass, its claws raking against it. The window didn't break, but the force of its attack sent me scrambling backward. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, threw on my boots, and bolted out the front door. I didn't care about the woods, or the dark, or the footprints. Anything was better than staying in that cabin. As I sprinted down the dirt road, I could hear it behind me. Its guttural growls and heavy, uneven footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. The creature's growls were just feet away when I finally got the door open and threw myself inside. I started the engine and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the road, its wide grin illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. I drove straight to the nearest town and didn't stop until I was parked in a well-lit gas station. I spent the rest of the night in the car, locked with the engine running, until the sun came up. I told myself I'd call the cabin owner, demand an explanation, maybe even report what I'd seen, but I never did, because deep down, I knew no one would believe me. And honestly, I don't want to know what that thing was. I didn't go home that morning. Instead, I drove aimlessly, putting as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me down the road. But the road remained empty, save for the occasional car or truck. After about 3 hours of driving, I pulled into a diner off the highway. My hands were still trembling as I sipped a cup of coffee, the warmth doing little to settle my nerves. The waitress noticed my state, but thankfully she didn't ask questions. I couldn't have answered them if she had. Once I felt steady enough, I pulled out my phone. Despite the terrible signal, I managed to search for the rental website. But when I typed in the address of the cabin, something strange happened. The listing was gone. No photos, no description, nothing. It was as if it had never existed. A chill ran down my spine. How could that be? I checked my email for the confirmation details, the payment receipt, anything to prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The emails were gone, completely wiped from my inbox. I stared at the screen, trying to process what this meant. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the owner taken it down after what happened? Did someone erase it deliberately? Or was it something worse? Something I couldn't begin to understand. As I sat there, the events of the previous night played over and over in my head. The tapping, the footprints, the creature's face, and that grin. God, I'd never forget that grin. It wasn't just a predator's smile. It was knowing, as if it took pleasure in my terror. By the time I left the diner, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to talk about it. Not to the police, not to friends, not to anyone. People wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't want them to. The last thing I needed was someone curious enough to go looking for that place. For weeks after, I had nightmares. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that guttural growl or feeling the weight of those black, empty eyes staring at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. About a month later, something happened that shattered whatever flimsy logic I'd been clinging to. I was at a friend's housewarming party, trying to force some normalcy back into my life. I'd been avoiding social gatherings, but this one felt safe. Just a few familiar faces, some drinks, and no mention of cabins or woods. For a while, it worked. I almost felt like myself again. Then someone new arrived, a friend of a friend. He was tall, lanky, and a little awkward. Nothing unusual. But as he stepped into the room, I felt my stomach drop. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. And then he smiled. It wasn't the same grin, not exactly, but there was an echo of it in the way his lips curled, just a little too wide, his teeth just a little too sharp. I froze, my drink slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at me. The stranger's eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I swore I saw something flicker in their depths, something dark and endless, like the void outside that cabin window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice perfectly normal, perfectly human. I muttered an apology, blaming the spilled drink, and quickly excused myself. But as I left the party, I felt his gaze follow me all the way to the door. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew where I'd been, what I'd seen, maybe even what had followed me back. That was a year ago. I moved to a new city after that, far from any woods or cabins. I keep to myself, avoiding crowds and strangers, and I never ever let myself be alone at night. but every so often I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moves just a little too fast, or a figure standing too still in a crowded place. And when I look, it's gone. I don't know what I brought back from that cabin, or if it was ever truly gone in the first place. All I know is this: some doors once opened can never be closed. The cabin wasn't supposed to be rented out that night. That's what the guy at the front desk mumbled, his eyes darting nervously between me and the old reservation book. "Ah, yes, we had a cancellation," he said, sliding the key across the counter without meeting my gaze. You'll have it all to yourself." That's what I wanted, a secluded retreat in the middle of nowhere. It had been a rough year, and the idea of quiet solitude in a rustic, isolated cabin seemed like a perfect way to reset. Still, his hesitation nagged at me as I drove up the winding gravel path into the woods. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a dark, still lake. It looked just as advertised: cozy, weathered, and welcoming. But as I parked my car and stepped out into the cold air, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something about the way the trees seemed to close in, the utter lack of sound, felt wrong. Shaking it off, I hauled my bags inside and locked the door. The interior was just as quaint as I'd hoped: a stone fireplace, hand-carved furniture, and a creaky old staircase leading to a loft bedroom. The only oddity was the massive antique mirror mounted above the fireplace, its ornate frame gleaming in the flickering light of the single lantern I'd brought in. I remember thinking it didn't fit the rustic aesthetic. It was too grand, too heavy, almost regal. Its reflective surface seemed to suck up the dim light, making the room feel darker. I shrugged and lit the fire, settling in for what I thought would be an uneventful night. The fire crackled warmly, its glow casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Despite the warmth, an unease I couldn't shake lingered. It wasn't the isolation, I'd craved that, but the oppressive quiet. No wind in the trees, no chirping insects, not even the gentle lap of the lake against the shore. It was as if the world beyond the cabin didn't exist. I chalked it up to nerves and poured myself a drink, sinking into the worn armchair by the fire. The mirror loomed above me, reflecting the flames in a strange, warped way. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept drifting back, drawn by a flicker of movement. Something in the reflection, just at the edge, didn't match the room. I leaned forward, squinting at the mirror. Behind me, the reflection showed a faint, shadowy figure standing near the staircase. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. Just the empty staircase. I laughed it off, a trick of the light, I told myself. The whiskey playing games. I decided to head to bed. Climbing the creaky stairs, I tried to ignore how the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the cabin itself was exhaling around me. The loft bedroom was cozy, the bed piled high with heavy quilts. I crawled in, pulling the covers tight, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified: the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the faint rustle of the trees outside, and footsteps. No, that was impossible. I froze, listening intently. There it was again. Soft, deliberate, moving across the cabin floor below me. My throat went dry. I had locked the door, hadn't I? Quietly, I slipped out of bed and crept to the edge of the loft. Peering down into the living room, my stomach churned. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in darkness, except for the mirror. It shimmered faintly, like a pond catching moonlight, and in its surface, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, moving in the room below, their shapes vague and wrong. They didn't walk, they drifted, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. The noise echoed through the cabin, and instantly all movement in the mirror stopped. Every figure turned, their hollow eyes locking onto me. Then, one by one, they began to climb the stairs. Panic surged through me. I ran to the bed and grabbed the lantern, its feeble light casting weak beams into the dark. The footsteps were louder now, impossibly heavy. I could hear the wood groan under their weight. I didn't wait to see what would emerge from the shadows. I bolted for the window. I threw it open, the icy air biting my face. The drop wasn't far, maybe 10 feet, but the ground below was jagged with rocks and tree roots. Behind me, I heard the creak of the top step. No time. I jumped, landing hard and rolling painfully onto my side. For a moment, I lay there, gasping, until I heard them again. The footsteps now outside, crunching on the gravel path behind me. I didn't look back. I ran, crashing through the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms. The forest felt endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. I stumbled into the lake's clearing, its black water rippling faintly in the moonlight. My car was just ahead, parked near the edge. I could see the faint glint of its windshield. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, faster. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, spinning it around on the narrow path. In the rear-view mirror, I saw them, standing at the tree line, their shapes blending with the shadows. They didn't follow, just stood there, watching as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose, until the sight of other cars and open fields reassured me I was back in the world of the living. I told myself I'd imagined it, that isolation had played tricks on me, but that doesn't explain the scratches on my arms or the faint handprints on the inside of the car window. I'll never know what those things were or why they were waiting for me in that cabin. But I know this. Sometimes solitude isn't peaceful. It's a trap set for the living by something that doesn't belong in our world. And it almost had me. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires was the first thing that struck me. That, and the way the towering pines swallowed the light whole. The rental cabin looked like it had been sitting there for decades, nestled in the woods just outside of Asheville. It wasn't on the map. Not really. The listing on the site was vague. Rustic charm for nature lovers. And the directions were handwritten by the owner, complete with warnings about spotty GPS. It was my first night alone in years. No roommates, no partner, no one asking me for a thing. Just me, a couple of horror novels, and a weekend of silence. Heaven, right? I stepped out of the car, the late October air biting at my skin. The cabin was unassuming, wooden slats weathered gray, a roof that slumped slightly, and windows fogged with grime. It was perched on a slight hill, overlooking a lake that glittered under the sliver of moonlight. The first thing I noticed inside was the smell. Damp wood and something faintly sour, like milk left too long in the sun. I told myself it was normal for old cabins. The second thing was the silence. Not the comforting quiet I'd imagined, but an oppressive, heavy stillness. Even the frogs and crickets outside seemed muted. I unpacked quickly, shoving my bag into the only bedroom, before making myself a mug of cocoa. By 9 p.m., I was curled up in an old armchair, with a tattered blanket, book in hand. I thought I'd feel at peace. Instead, I felt watched. It was subtle at first, that weird sixth sense we all get sometimes. But then, halfway through a chapter, I caught it. The unmistakable sound of floorboards creaking. My eyes darted to the hallway. Empty. It's an old house, I mumbled to myself. Houses creak. It's nothing. But my gut churned, because the creak hadn't come from just anywhere. It was right outside the bedroom door. I closed the book, stood up, and walked over, trying to steady my breathing. The hallway stretched into darkness, broken only by the faint outline of the bedroom door. I stepped closer, flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb above me flickered and stayed dead. Another creak. Not the wood this time. This was behind me, the living room window. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The chair I'd been sitting in was now turned slightly, facing the window. I hadn't touched it. I would have heard if it scraped across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the wind rattling the trees outside. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was paranoia. Maybe I hadn't noticed the chair before. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and double-checked the back door before heading to bed. My skin prickled as I lay there in the dark, every creak and groan of the cabin amplified by the silence. But nothing happened. I drifted off eventually. I don't know what woke me. Maybe the cold, maybe the silence. But at 3:17 a.m., my eyes snapped open. I wasn't alone. There was breathing, slow, deliberate, not mine. I froze, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my ears. It was coming from the corner of the room. My phone was on the nightstand. Slowly, painstakingly, I turned my head, reaching for it. The glow of the screen lit up the room. There was nothing in the corner, but the bedroom door was open. I didn't leave it open. I bolted upright, grabbing the nearest thing, a lamp, and stumbled toward the door. The hallway stretched out in front of me, bathed in faint moonlight from the windows. The living room was silent. Still. Empty. Then I heard it. Faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the front porch. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Tap, tap, tap. I tiptoed toward the front door, every step making my heart pound harder. The tapping grew louder as I approached. Through the frosted glass of the window, I could make out a faint shape, tall, unmoving. I swallowed hard, pressing my ear to the door. The tapping stopped. Then something hit the door. Hard. I jumped back as it rattled on its hinges. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I sprinted for the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, but there was no signal. Then I heard it. The scraping of metal against wood. The sound of the front door unlocking. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, backing up until I hit the far wall. The scraping stopped. Then silence. Minutes passed. Hours, maybe. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the cabin was empty. But on the floor, carved deep into the wood, were two words: "Come back." I didn't, and I never will. I didn't leave that cabin with much. Just my bag, my car keys, and the gnawing certainty that I'd narrowly escaped something far beyond human. The moment my tires hit the main road, I didn't look back. Not at the woods, not at the cabin, and definitely not at the shadow I thought I saw standing in the porch window. I should have driven straight home, but there was this itch in the back of my mind. You know that feeling when something doesn't make sense, but you can't let it go? That cabin wasn't on any map. The directions were handwritten. The entire experience screamed wrong, and I needed to know why. So instead of heading back to my apartment, I drove straight into town. It was early morning by the time I parked at a diner, the kind of place where the locals hung out and knew everything about everyone. I walked in, still shaken, and ordered coffee, figuring out how to phrase the question without sounding like a lunatic. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, refilled my cup and asked, "Rough night?" You could say that, I replied. I rented a cabin out past the lake. Thought I'd get some peace and quiet. She froze, her hand gripping the coffee pot. Which cabin? I described it. The hill, the lake, the porch. She set the pot down carefully and leaned in close. Sweetheart, that cabin's been empty for decades. My stomach turned. No, it hasn't. I stayed there last night. Found it online. Her expression darkened. You can't find that cabin online. Not anymore. Not since the fire. The diner suddenly felt colder. What fire? She glanced around, lowering her voice like she was afraid someone might hear. Years ago, a family rented that cabin. Husband, wife, little boy. They were city folk, out for a weekend in the woods. One night, something happened. Neighbors said they heard screaming, saw strange lights in the trees. By the time anyone got there, the place was gone, burned to ash. They never found the family, just the boy's teddy bear, charred and sitting on the front porch. I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry, but it's still there. The cabin. I stayed there. She shook her head. Whatever you saw, it wasn't the cabin. At least, not the one that burned down. I pushed my coffee aside, suddenly nauseous. My mind raced back to last night. The chair that moved, the open door, the tapping, the message carved into the floorboards. Come back. I stumbled out of the diner without another word, fumbling with my car keys. The waitress didn't try to stop me, but as I pulled away, I saw her watching from the window, her face pale and tight with worry. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I got home, unpacked, and pretended it never happened. But things followed me. Little things at first, shadows that didn't belong, the faint smell of sour milk in my apartment. Then, the tapping started again. Not on the porch this time, but on the inside of my closet door. Last night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. There was a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in wet streaks. You never left. This morning, I checked my emails. There's a new listing in my inbox. Same cabin, same handwritten directions. I deleted it, but the message won't go away. Every time I refresh, it's there, waiting, calling me back. I don't think I'll survive if I answer, but I'm not sure I'll survive if I don't. It started with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, one of those that flicker in just the wrong rhythm to dig under your skin. I was midway through another night shift at the 24-hour gas station just off Route 17. You know the kind, reeking of old coffee, shelves lined with stale chips, and the perpetual hum of the ice cream freezer. That night, a fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing up the world outside. The highway was nothing but black asphalt disappearing into a wall of gray. I hated working these shifts alone, but we'd just lost our only other night clerk. Guess it was my turn to hold down the fort until corporate hired someone new. It wasn't long before the first weird thing happened. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the front window. At first, I thought it was just some bug drawn to the neon open sign, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced up from the register, squinting through the fog-drenched pane. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. Hello? My voice cracked, embarrassing me even in my solitude. No answer. Steeling myself, I stepped out from behind the counter and moved closer to the glass. My breath fogged up the pane as I leaned in, searching for movement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A hand. Pale, long fingers, almost skeletal, reached up and pressed against the outside of the glass. My heart leapt into my throat. I stumbled back, knocking over a rack of potato chips. The hand was gone. I fumbled for the phone, but of course, the damn landline had been out for days. Cell service out here? Forget it. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I convinced myself it was a prank. Some drunk weirdo messing around. But deep down, I knew better. I sat back behind the counter, trying to focus on restocking cigarettes and lottery tickets. For a while, it was quiet again, save for the buzz of that stupid light. Then the power flickered, plunging the store into a brief, suffocating darkness. When the light snapped back on, something wasn't right. One of the aisles, the one with the cheap candy, had been knocked over. Candy bars scattered across the floor. No way had that been like that before. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and stepped into the aisle. My palms were slick with sweat. "Is someone here?" I called out. My voice echoed against the empty shelves. No answer. Then, the freezer door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The freezer doors gleamed under the flickering light, their surfaces coated with condensation. Slowly, I moved toward them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed colder than it should have been, like the chill from the freezers had leaked into the entire store. My breath puffed out in short, nervous clouds. And then I saw it. One of the glass doors had fogged over, and written in the condensation, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "Look behind you." I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. My throat felt tight, like something invisible was wrapping around it. I didn't want to turn. Every cell in my body screamed, "Don't turn around." But I did. The flashlight beam swept over the empty aisles, shaking as I scanned for anything out of place. There was nothing, just shelves of junk food and energy drinks. The fogged-up window near the entrance. The door I swore I had locked earlier, now standing slightly ajar. A tendril of fog, curling in like a lazy, creeping snake. And then, movement. At the edge of the beam, something darted between the shelves. Not walking, crawling. I backed up toward the counter, flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It appeared then, just for a second, peeking out from the corner of the pet food aisle. A face. But it wasn't a face. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched unnaturally tight over bone. The thing leaned out farther, its head cocking to one side like it was studying me. Then it scuttled out of sight, faster than anything human should move. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted toward the front door, slamming into the glass, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, the cold making them numb. Behind me, I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it was everywhere. From the freezer doors, the windows, even the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. The gas pumps were barely visible through the haze, their lights dim and flickering. That's when I heard the voice. "Where are you going?" It came from all directions, deep and rasping, like someone trying to talk through a throat full of gravel. I turned, flashlight beam slicing through the fog, and saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, crawling on all fours, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally. Their pale bodies seemed to shimmer half solid, like they were caught between this world and another. They were closing in, surrounding me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for my car. The keys were in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly, it felt like it took an eternity to pull them out. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, its beam casting eerie shadows as it spun. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and oppressive, and the creatures were there, circling the car. Their hands scraped against the glass, leaving smears of condensation behind. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. They lunged at the car, their hands slamming against the windows, their bodies writhing and twisting in impossible ways. I floored it. The tires squealed as I shot forward, the creatures scattering in the headlights. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove through the fog, the empty highway stretching out before me like a lifeline. Eventually, the fog lifted. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. I quit the next day. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it. The tapping. And I can't help but wonder if they ever really let me go. The diner where I worked night shifts wasn't anything special. Just a run-of-the-mill greasy spoon sitting off a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. Most nights were uneventful, serving truckers, wiping counters, and flipping through an ancient magazine to pass the hours. But that night was different. It started when the clock on the wall chimed midnight, a ritual so mundane that I usually didn't notice it. This time, though, the sound stretched on longer than it should have, like the chime was being dragged, distorted, pulled apart. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, sending the room into brief bursts of darkness. I glanced toward the door, half hoping to see a customer walk in and break the eerie silence. Instead, the night outside seemed thicker than usual, the parking lot lights barely piercing the foggy darkness. Then the bell above the door jingled. No one had walked in. That's when I noticed the booth at the far end of the diner. It was occupied. I hadn't heard anyone come in. The man sitting there had his back to me. He wore a black jacket, the kind with a hood, though it was down. His dark hair was greasy and matted, and he sat perfectly still, staring out the window into the nothingness beyond. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't turn around. Great. Another weirdo. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, the sound of my sneakers sticking to the linoleum, filling the oppressive silence. "Coffee?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were glassy, unblinking. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "what's watching when you're alone?" I froze, coffee pot trembling in my hand. What?" His lips curled into a grin, not a friendly one. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered again. The man's grin widened, and when the lights steadied, the booth was empty. My stomach dropped. The coffee pot slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I stood frozen, staring at the shards of glass and the growing puddle of coffee at my feet. The tapping continued, echoing from the kitchen in the back. Each sound felt deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. My mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe it was a raccoon that got in through the back door. Maybe it was just the pipes. Maybe I was imagining things, but none of those thoughts made my legs stop trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The diner was dead silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and that god-awful tapping. I knew I had to check. As much as I wanted to grab my keys and bolt for my car, My feet betrayed me. I stepped cautiously toward the kitchen, every squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum, sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The door to the kitchen was ajar, swinging slightly as if it had just been pushed open. The fluorescent light above it flickered erratically. "Anyone there?" I asked, louder this time. The tapping stopped. My breath hitched, and I clenched my fists to keep them from shaking. I stepped through the door and scanned the room. Everything was where it should be. The counters, the griddle, the industrial sink, nothing out of place. Until I saw the freezer door. It was cracked open. I knew I'd closed it. I was sure of it. The freezer was old, and it didn't stay cool unless it was properly latched. I edged closer, feeling the cold air snake out and brush against my skin. The tapping resumed, louder now, and it was definitely coming from inside the freezer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, metallic, rancid, and suffocating. Inside, the shelves were empty, save for a single object on the middle rack. It was a jar. The glass was smeared with something dark and viscous, and inside, a mass of something pulsed faintly, as though alive. My stomach churned, but before I could back away, I heard a voice. "I told you," it whispered, low and guttural. I spun around, and there he was, the man from the booth, now standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his grin was stretched wider than before, exposing teeth that were jagged and wrong. "You ever wonder what's watching?" he hissed, his voice distorted, like static on an old TV. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the slick freezer floor. The jar fell from the shelf, shattering on the ground. The thing inside spilled out, a writhing, fleshy mass that began to grow. It unfurled long, spindly limbs that slapped against the walls, its surface glistening with a black, tar-like substance. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, as the creature turned toward me, its eyeless face twisted and shifted, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Run," the man said, his voice almost gleeful. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the kitchen, through the diner, and into the foggy night. My car was the only thing I could think of, my sanctuary from whatever nightmare was unfolding behind me. As I reached the parking lot, I glanced back at the diner. The windows were dark, but I could see movement inside, shadows slithering across the walls, something too large to fit in that tiny kitchen. I jumped into my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine roaring. Tires screeching, I tore out of the lot, leaving the diner and its horrors behind. But as I sped down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, his grin still stretched wide, his hand raised in a slow, mocking wave. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quit the diner the next day, but some nights, when the world is too quiet, I swear I can still hear the tapping. It started like any other night shift. The fluorescent lights in the back room of the gas station flickered with their usual irritating hum. I'd taken this job for the quiet. Somewhere I could collect my thoughts while dealing with the odd customer or two, mostly truckers and night owls. I'd been working there for 6 months without incident. That night, though, was different. It was the dead of winter, and a brutal windstorm had turned the streets into a graveyard of fallen branches and trash. I leaned against the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when the door chimed. A man walked in. His face was shrouded in the shadow of a hoodie, and he moved deliberately, too deliberate for someone who just wanted chips or smokes. Something about him immediately set my nerves on edge. He didn't look at me, didn't grab anything. He just wandered the aisles like he was searching for something. The cameras buzzed overhead. I glanced up at the monitors above the counter. I'd grown used to watching people on those screens. Most were harmless, predictable. But as I scanned the feeds, my stomach turned. There was a glitch in the camera. A second figure flickered into view behind the man. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally as it watched him. I blinked hard, thinking it was a software issue. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. The man finally approached the counter, dropping a pack of gum and a small black notebook onto the surface. I rang him up, barely able to meet his eyes. "You working alone tonight?" he asked. It was a simple question, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. His voice was low, grating, like the sound of gravel under tires. "Yeah," I replied, regretting it instantly. He grinned, revealing teeth that were uneven and stained. He paid in cash, shoved the change into his pocket, and left without another word. But as the door swung shut, I noticed something he'd left behind. The notebook. It was small and weathered, its cover marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with numbers, rows and rows of handwritten code that made no sense to me. Then at the bottom of one page, I saw something that made my breath hitch. "Do not stay until 3:17 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:48. For the next 29 minutes, I tried to shake it off as some kind of prank. But as the hour approached, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, longer than usual. The cameras in the corner started to glitch again, showing static interspersed with brief, distorted images of the store. And then there were the noises, soft, guttural whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At 3:16, the power went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint blinking glow of the exit sign. And then the door chimed again. The chime echoed unnaturally in the silent store. My stomach knotted as the air around me turned cold, like I'd stepped into a meat locker. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the darkness. The aisles stretched out like corridors to nowhere, and the shadows seemed to writhe at the edges of the beam. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, trembling. No answer. The chime came again. The door hadn't opened. It was still shut, but the sound repeated over and over, like someone was walking in and out, or something was toying with me. Then a sound from the back room, a dragging noise, heavy and wet, like a sack of meat being pulled across the floor. My body froze, my breathing shallow. The noise stopped, replaced by a faint clicking sound, like fingernails tapping glass. I slowly aimed my flashlight toward the office door. It creaked open, just a crack, revealing only darkness within. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible even to myself. A voice answered, low and distorted. "You should have left." I nearly dropped my phone. The voice came from everywhere, above me, behind me, inside me. I took a step back, my heel catching the edge of the counter. That's when I saw it on the cameras. The monitors, somehow still active despite the power outage, showed the store from every angle, and in every feed, it was there. The thing I'd seen earlier, flickering like a broken signal. It stood impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. Its body was grotesquely elongated, with limbs that bent in ways no humans should. Its face was nothing but a void, darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved slowly down the aisle, its steps silent but deliberate, coming straight toward me. I spun around, shining my light. Nothing was there. Yet on the cameras, it was only feet away. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the back door. The dragging sound started again, louder now, as if it were right behind me. I reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling into the freezing night air. The parking lot was empty, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and peeled out of the lot. The rear-view mirror taunted me. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, terrified of what I might see. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in my living room, shaking. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from an unknown number. "You forgot the notebook." My blood ran cold. I didn't respond, didn't sleep, didn't even move for the rest of the night. When morning came, I called my manager and quit. I never went back to that gas station. Weeks later, I saw a news report. A night shift worker at the same gas station had gone missing. The police found the store in disarray, the back room smeared with streaks of something unidentifiable. They never found the worker, or any evidence of who or what had been there. I've kept the story to myself all these years, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That chime. And I know it hasn't forgotten.